Yo, what is up, everybody? By the time this video is out, Firestorm should be out. So, a little late, but let's talk about the archetypes of Firestorm and what they're trying to do. Now, we're going to talk about some old archetypes, some past archetypes. I'm not going to go over every champion archetype because not all the champions have enough cards to build a whole deck out of. Specifically, Demeter only has a couple cards that, yes, could be relevant in an Earth deck, but don't make a whole deck on their own. As well as Apollo, yes, it goes into cows, but not a whole archetype on its own. As well as Aelus, a couple of cards, not a whole archetype, but I will be going over stuff that's in the new champion archetypes, as well as stuff that makes up other decks like spiders and stuff. So let's start with the Divine Runes. Alright, so let's start with the champions of Zeus archetypes. Obviously we have Zeus, everyone pretty much knows it. This card's been a monster in all the formats past, and we have multiple cards that go with it. Now Zeus's champions generally like to be this aggressive, rune destruction, and kind of disruption dodging archetype in a sense. So to explain, let's start with the one drops. We have Fulguris, Elechick, and Tana Strike, champions of Zeus. These cards all kind of float in the same space where they have decent attack stats with their effects, whereas Elechick can buff itself whenever you have Zeus in play. Fulguris gets to buff itself when it uses its effect to destroy a back row, and Titanic Strike has good stats and allows you to get a Thunderstorm, also on the outage to destroy back row. This means that the early champions of Zeus, the one drops, are pretty good at disrupting back row, as well as getting in for decent attacks when paired with Zeus's attack producing and defense reducing abilities. We see a lot of back row hate with these cards just on the one drops, which generally will allow you to do things like Fulguris, destroy a back row, and then when your opponent potentially chains, let's say, Tsunami or PTA to your Fulguris or your Titanic Strike, the kind of second half of Zeus's archetype jumps in, which was Grypheus and Voltempest, which the Ascensions like to kind of tag in over the other champions of Zeus. So Grypheus lets you kind of special send it over any of your champions of Zeus. So if your Fulguris gets PTA'd or Tsunami, you can go, cool, I'll special send my Grypheus over it, and now I can continue attacking. So it lets it kind of tag in, lets you play around some of your opponent's soft removals. Gorgons will impact the Zeus archetype pretty heavily because it will stop you from using your Ascension here, but it will allow you to kind of just tag in the Grypheus, keep attacking, dodge PTAs, maybe dodge Tsunamis if your Fulguris is trying to pop a Tsunami or Titanic Strike trying to pop a Tsunami, and keep your pressure going. And then if any of your champion Zeus gets destroyed and you have no more Elestrals on board, you can cast a Voltempest, which is just a 14/7 vanilla effectively, from your hand into play on your opponent's turn when your Elestrals get destroyed, which is pretty significantly powerful because it could be your opponent attacks a few times. On the last attack, you go, okay, now I drop my Voltempest as surprise 14/7 body paired with the Zeus. It will attack over anything, including a Pantera, which makes the archetype very much this aggressive, low to the ground archetype that has the ability to dodge removal or dodge soft removal, dodge soft interaction, and ascend into Grypheus and Voltempest for other plays. Paired with other Thunder cards, this archetype's looking to be a pretty aggressive, kind of constant flow of Elestrals, and you have cards like Zeus's Call in the archetype to search out your big guys, your 2 costs, your 3 costs if you need to find them, or your 1 cost if you're struggling to find your 1 cost. One of the biggest weaknesses of this deck, though, as well as other cards that involve Zeus, is you need Zeus in play. So if your opponent is running their own destruction, like a P-Gust, their own Thunderstorms, their own ways to remove Zeus, a lot of the archetype does get pretty hampered because you can't Zeus's Call anymore, you can't use Fulguris anymore, Elechick is a vanilla. A lot of this archetype revolves around just making sure you have Zeus in play for all the kind of passive and active effects to be enabled. So be aware, you need to protect your Zeus, maybe use something like a Divine Blessing to protect him. But overall, champions of Zeus are very aggressive low to ground bodies that can tag into their Ascensions when you need to generate additional advantage and kind of blank things like PTA, Tsunamis, and other soft removal.
Subscribe to words.
Subscribe to words.
Subscribe to words, bro.
Subscribe to Word.
Sub to words, by the way.
It's literally just us telling people to subscribe to words. No!
Alright, so next up we're going to talk about the Champions of Poseidon, another base set champion that's getting a lot of good support, and actually a lot of the current Champions of Poseidon support the old versions of their Elestrals like Glaubi and Majesty and Javlantis in a way that the Zeus stuff didn't do with like old Voltempest. So what's really cool with the new Champions of Poseidon is you have an archetype focused around nexusing and receiving, most of them specifically from Poseidon. So Sluggle is specifically when it receives 1 or more with water with Poseidon's effect, you can special send it to Glaubi from your hand or deck. And that's where the deck gets really interesting, because now you can go into New Globby, which New Globby is a little bit more aggressive, water reanimator focused card that allows you to search Atlantis or Rise, allowing you to get the other half of your reanimation pieces from the deck, as well as gives you a potential, 7-10 Globby on board if you get Atlantis, so it's a pretty powerful beater that you just ascend into. But the really cool part is you go into Old Globby, which now if you go into Old Globby, you'll end up with 3 spirits on the Globby after the Ascension and the Nexus, allowing you to go into the New Majesty or the Old Majesty. So the Old Majesty will give you some blanket Celestial protection for your water enchanted Elestrals, which is probably going to be decently good in this format going into like fire decks, especially going against like Kinlios and stuff nowadays, which there's a lot more fire Nexus relevance here. So protection from Celestial effects is more beneficial than it was in the past. Or you go into New Majesty with Globby, which gives you a floodgate that allows you to stop all your opponents' not water enchanted Elestrals effectively, or all your opponents' Elestrals that are enchanted with anything but water are now misenchanted with only water because it turns all spirits into water instead of the original element. This does unfortunately hurt you in the fact of you can't play Tsunami into your opponent's Elestrals anymore if they're playing fire or anything other than water, but it does give you a really powerful effect that just suppresses effectively all your opponent's Elestrals as they play the game, and potentially you can just put Majesty in defense if you need to heal some water back, making kind of a giant healing body into a potential suppression shut-off effect that if you play with like Altar and stuff, you might be able to finagle with your opponent's stuff and get some healing done and then switch back to attack position. There's a lot you can do with that, but generally the Sluggle side of things, you go Sluggle into any Globby you want depending on your deck archetype or the position that you're in right now in the game, and then jump into either Majesty that you might need potentially based on your game state. Now, do champion a Poseidon Majesty looks very threatening as a floodgate. However, there's a lot of like negatives to this where it's got really low attack stat. You need Poseidon in place, so there's a lot of ways to attack that floodgate effect and shut it off. So it's not all-encompassing, but having the heal and defense position effect is pretty decent as like your backup if your Poseidon gets destroyed, and you can just put Majesty in defense and protect it. The other half of this archetype is Vertaqua, which allows you to, if you Nexus to Vertaqua, you can special send it into Javelantis from your hand or deck, and then the Javelantis, when you cast Tsunami, you can special send Javelantis from your hand to one of your water Elestrals, and then your water enchanted Elestrals deal piercing damage while Poseidon is enchanted. So the important part with this, again, if you're playing Champions of Poseidon, you might not be able to play Tsunami effectively if you're playing the New Majesty. However, if you're playing Tsunami, you have the ability to kind of tag in this Javelantis over things, and then you also get a bunch of piercing Elestrals on board depending on how you play your Javelantis, especially if you have this Majesty in play from the turn prior. You go then Vertaqua into Javelantis. You can get some pretty significant piercing damage going. And then the last couple cards of this archetype are Champion of Poseidon Galaxy, which swaps every Elestral's attack and defense until the end of turn, which it's Galaxy. Let's be honest, it's pretty powerful. The fact that it does all Elestrals at the same time could be detrimental to some of your other Elestrals in play. Like, it'd be great to switch this Galaxy's attack to 5. However, if you have other Elestrals in play, you might not want that swap to go to everything at the same time, or it might kind of finagle with some of your numbers you don't need to change. But generally, this Galaxy is looking to be pretty powerful on its own. Doesn't need to be in the archetype to do well. And then Poseidon's Fury allows you to disenchant all the water off your Poseidon to basically force your opponent to blow up their board, potentially. It allows you to just kind of throw a bunch of spirits on Poseidon, maybe even use a Divine Healing on Poseidon, and then use Poseidon's Fury as a board wipe, or kind of a targeted wipe. If your opponent has 1 3-drop in play and you Poseidon's Fury for 1, you can basically force them to disenchant 1 off their 3-drop and destroy it. If they have a bunch of little Elestrals in play, you can do like 4, make them kind of pick and choose what they need to destroy through the disenchant of Poseidon's Fury. Really cool removal card that is almost a board wipe, but can get very expensive, but has some really cool synergy with things like Divine Healing. But generally, the Poseidon's archetype is a very, I wouldn't want to say a toolboxy archetype, but it's an archetype that kind of goes in multiple directions, and the ability to bridge the gap between those directions, between like Reanimator and piercing stuff and like a lockdown kind of strategy and control strategies, is really cool and varied. And I think there's a lot of kind of things you can do with this deck to tie into old Water Nexus piles and just make a really interesting, unique version of Water Nexus with the Champions of Poseidon. Alright, so next up, let's talk about Hermes as an archetype. Now, Hermes is a wind toolbox, underworld focused deck, which It definitely carries over the toolboxing nature from like Olus and stuff. So Hermes specifically likes to send things to the underworld, and a lot of things get triggered in the underworld or want to be in the underworld for the other cards. So Hermes straight up just sends Wind Elestrals to the underworld's effect. And we're going to start with the runes here. So we have Hermes Trickery, Zeus of Hermes, and Talaria of Hermes. Now, Hermes Trickery is definitely the most powerful of the bunch here, which allows you to special cast an Elestral from your underworld by destroying the Elestral you have in play, but saving the spirits on the Elestral in play to cast the new Elestral. So this allows you to do something like destroy a Pantera to go enchant, I don't know, like a Hydra into play with 3 spirits on it. There's shenanigans you can do there by going kind of down the Ascension ladder, but also you can go across, where if you destroy a 1-drop to get a 1-drop into play, you might be able to do something like P-Gust at kind of a counter speed, or trigger, healing, or trigger a way to kind of battle fade your opponent, where if your opponent goes, I'm attacking your Celestial, attack is good, in battle step you Hermes Trickery to get like a Nemesail back in to heal up, but your attack gets hit direct because you did the battle step. There's a new Celestial in play, direct, that's a rules thing. It basically allows you to kind of really shenanigans around your opponent's attacks and shenanigans around your opponent's board by toolboxing Elestrals from your underworld and triggering a bunch of different receive effects. So you play like a Toxic Swarm, ping for 1, tag out the Toxic Swarm into a P-Gust with Hermes Trickery, blow up a back row, maybe then on your following turn you extend that P-Gust into something. It really allows you to do a lot. So Hermes Trickery is probably the best counter rune potentially in the set, but it's really powerful and lots of shenanigans you can do that I'd have to make a whole video about what you could do with this card. Talaria is a potentially +3 if your opponent destroys the Elestral empowered by it, but it's generally one of the weaker cards. Maybe it's a really expensive Argo target, but Talaria it does want to see Elestrals get destroyed in battle and get you a bunch of draw power and stuff, but overall I don't see Talaria seeing a ton of play. And then Caduceus, or Caduceus, however it's pronounced, plays in the Hermes archetype, where it does similar to Hermes Trickery, allows you to tag out Elestrals from your underworld when things are destroyed. However, it's only a 1-spirit Wind Elestral in your underworld, so it's a lot more limited than Hermes Trickery, but doesn't have the restriction of requiring Hermes in play to use it. And it's another way to just shenanigans things in the underworld, like if you have a Hydrake in the underworld and you crash with another Hydrake, you tag in your new Hydrake and you have a Twindra in play now too. Like, there's a ton you can do, and the fact that the 1 cost is pretty powerful and significant, as long as you can play and force your opponent to destroy things, or you get to destroy things on your own kind of merit and when you want to. So now we looked at the runes. The Elestrals are the cool part of the deck, the important part, I guess you could say, of the deck. It's a Wind Toolbox deck that sends things to the underworld. So how do we use things in the underworld? With Rise from the Ashes limited to 1. And there's not really any Rise from in the archetype other than what we just spoke about, with the ability to kind of tag in Elestrals for other Elestrals. However, there are effects that trigger when things are sent to the underworld, with Carrion performing basically a tab puff effect. So you go Hermes, send Carrion to your underworld, you can special cast Carrion with a wind from your underworld, making it effectively the same cost as Carrion, but being a kind of search target off Hermes, which probably makes it better than a tad buff. And that allows you to send into any of your Wind 2-drops, which could be relevant for any Wind deck. The 2-drops you want to send to in this are pretty powerful, except for Carry Off. Carry Off is something that its toolbox effect is it's basically an Earthquake, or maybe closer related to like a PT or a New Moon on being sent to the underworld, making it a pretty expensive destruction card. But again, we're looking at a toolbox. And then other cards you might want to send with Hermes are things like Exaltair to swap out with your Hermes Trickeries, or things like Hydrakes and P-Gust and receive effects to switch out again with your Hermes Trickery. So the ability to send any Wind Elestral is potentially pretty powerful in this deck. And they want to be, and the cards in Hermes archetype want to be there. Cocktoodle is something that allows you to suppress, so you have suppression, you have destruction, you have ramp, and then you have kind of the other support cards of the package, which Spine-Nymph and Spinasect are in Earth and Earth Wind. So Spine-Nymph allows you to search Hermes, which is pretty important for this deck. And also you can disenchant Wind from Spine-Nymph to special send it to Spinasect from your hand or deck, which is relevant because it allows you to use your Carrion to ascend into Spine-Nymph, to use Spine-Nymph's ability twice, and then special send it to Spinasect and get a removal off of that, giving you more kind of options and paths with this deck to take. Spine-Effect is another removal card that wants to be cast, or you can send it to Nexus, so it's again you have the ability to Nexus off Hermes effect, you have the ability to ramp with a Carrion off Hermes effect, you have the ability to basically Earthquake something off a Carry Off, you can Cocktoodle to suppress something, or you can just send like something simple like an Exaltair to just prepare for future battle steps to shenanigans at your opponent. So generally, Hermes is a toolbox deck that will send tons of stuff to the underworld and then just tag it in, or use its various champions effects to kind of do tons of things. There's not really a direct thing I can say that this deck is doing other than potentially just carry off Swine Attack, removing cards off of a tutor, and then when you don't need to remove cards, you just kind of take swing advantage turns. Lots of things you can do with the deck, and it all is enabled by sending stuff to your underworld with Hermes effect, which can be expensive, but you get a lot of really cool effects off of what you're sending. So you're just sending stuff to trigger effects, making kind of a bonus to what Hermes is doing on top of what you're trying to play. So you're generating free card advantage to your underworld, as well as the cards you're drawing every turn. Really cool archetype. Generally just kind of sending stuff to the underworld and tagging it in for really cool fun stuff. Alright, and last up of the divine archetypes we're going over today is Hestia. Now Hestia on its own isn't really a fully fledged divine archetype. As far as divines go for this set and archetype, Hestia is a lot more diverse in what it kind of can enable with different decks, being a little bit more generic of the ability to just special cast any one-cost fire Elestrals. However, a lot of the Elestrals within the Champion Hestia archetype do kind of find ways to make relevance of that special cast, with like Champion Hestia Earth Scout, which allows you to search your deck for Champion Hestia, which if you're playing Earth Scout, you're probably getting Majursa, and if you're playing War Might, you're probably playing Floracne, because the general two main builds that Hestia is going to be focused in is number one, first and foremost, bears. So we're not talking about Hestia anymore, we're talking about the bear archetype, the Ursa archetype, which didn't get a ton of support in this set, but got just enough to make it probably a pretty relevant threat with the Champion Hestia Earth Scout and Majursa, which both will see at least a little bit of play in the Ursa deck, with Hestia being able to special cast Ursas like being special cast and getting put in play and swarming, and allowing to Majursa ascend and pop cards. Really powerful there. So on top of things like High Bear Nation, the Ursa deck is looking to be a pretty powerful kind of just swarm deck that allows you to also potentially just drop this bomb Majursa when your opponent's not prepared for it and blow up their board and swing with a bunch of little bears. It's pretty swingy, it's pretty expensive to get Majursa out no matter how you get Majursa out. Earth Scout Champion Hestia is just okay at finding Majursa, but there's other ways to get Majursa out, things like Ursaden, etc. But Hestia will at least allow you a little bit more enabling, or Champions Hestia a little bit more enabling to make the Ursa deck kind of peak here. And then while we're on Hestia, we can talk about Spiders. Spiders is a really interesting deck archetype that's heavily focused around Arachne's Lair. Without Arachne's Lair, this deck doesn't do a ton other than kind of attacking. And the deck is generally constantly trying to generate card advantage by playing one-drop spiders, maybe Floracne, depending on your archetype. And every time you play one of your spiders, you can draw a card. So you can turn Hestia into a spider, which is fine, draw a card, then normal cast another spider, which is already fine, draw another card, and then maybe one of those spiders that you cast for the normal cast was a Kite Might, allowing you to then disenchant Kite Might to toolbox for another spider to draw a card. Generally, spiders work kind of like Zeus, except you're toolboxing either War Mites or Frost Mites to attack over your opponent's Elestrals. And then you can kind of lith into a Parachne, which Parachne is kind of a lith that says as long as you have Arachne's Lair in, you can play this as a normal cast it and then draw a card. So its effect is effectively draw a card because you have Arachne's Lair to draw a card with in play already. So Spiders is looking to be a really powerful archetype that has really cool tag and like effects to find what you want to get through your opponent, and while you're doing that, drawing a bunch of cards. It is heavily disrupted by things like Gorgons to stop Kite Might from triggering, but even if your Kite Might gets destroyed, at least it replaces itself with Arachne's Lair, you drew a card. So Spiders likes to be this kind of low to the ground attacking archetype that just draws lots and lots of cards, allowing you to support your spiders as much as possible. Maybe find ways to ascend, and they don't need Hestia, but Hestia does kind of play in the deck a little bit. So again, we're talking about Champions of Hestia right now, but there's not a ton that Champions of Hestia does as an archetype on its own, but there are lots of really cool branching out archetypes you can do with Hestia. And the last thing you can kind of do with Hestia is a Fire Nexus strategy. So Hestia special casting out like a Kinleo, allowing you to do something else. The Hestia's Hearth card allows you to put extra fire on board, which again allows you to just kind of Nexus a bit more and have more leeway there. Your Torching can search Hestia in the Nexus once. If you have good fire receiving effects, you can use Torching to do that. So there is the ability for Hestia to also play in a Fire Nexus build. which is also somewhat supported by Hestia just by the fact of getting more cards on board, and a good Fire Divine rune to play in Fire Nexus is relevant. So Hestia does a lot more than the other archetypes, but does a little bit of a good thing in a lots of different archetypes. So again, bears, spiders, Fire Nexus all can see play with Hestia. Even some of the fire artifacts, which we'll get into in a moment, could also see some Hestia kind of boosting as well in the deck. Hestia is very versatile but expensive, but has some really cool effects and kind of enablings that it can do. Alright, so next up we have the Fire Artifact archetype, which technically has already been out in Shattered Stars, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this as a new archetype, but there are some significant buffs to this archetype in Firestorm with the addition of Anvil and Torch and just cheap, good artifacts to play. Anvil allowing you to kind of keep refunding your fire spirits, which we see Valkyrie's already kind of doing, allowing you to keep those spirits keep flowing onto board. Torch of Hestia is a decent attack buff for cheap that is good even if you have to just cast it for regular 2 attack for 1 cost, is pretty solid. So overall, the ability to kind of have these cheaper artifacts as well as a little bit more fire support with like Hestia makes fire artifacts a little bit stronger on top of your already being able to play Kinleo natively and stuff like that in the archetype. Fire artifacts sees a little bit of a bump. I'm not going to spend too much time on this archetype because we already have seen it through Shattered Stars, even though it's new. Next up, we're going to jump into Frost archetypes in this set, and we have 2 kind of important ones to talk about, but only one seems really competitive right now, and that's going to be the Nyx Mara. So we have Bunnyx, which is a 4/4 for 1. You can expend a Frost to search your deck for 2 Nyx Mara, which is important because we're sending 1 to the underworld and 1 to our hand. Because one of them it plays on our turn, one plays on our opponent's turn, and we constantly switch them out from the underworld. So starting with Nyx Mara Risen form, you expend Solar in order to target and destroy a face-down rune, and during the end phase, you have to send this Nyx Mara to the underworld and special send to the Fallen form from your hand deck or underworld. And then Fallen form is something that can't be targeted by invoked runes, making it pretty bulky and defensive. And during your opponent's end phase, it has to switch back to Risen form. So in your turn, you have the Solar version that pops face downs, and in your opponent's turn, you have something that's protected from invokes and a pretty big booty. And you constantly switch between the 2 of them over and over and over again, kind of building up spirits on them until you can potentially, hopefully, just blow up your opponent with Nyx Mara through Ascension and just do tons of damage. It's a really cool archetype that kind of plays in the Frost's ability to kind of play with the underworld a bit and tag in and tag out over and over again with these kind of really annoying Elestrals. The pros being you get kind of this self-contained engine of Nyx Mara's constantly swapping while you can do other things with your Frost deck. So this probably pairs well with like Cryoling or More Frost. Something that kind of like, with More Frost you can go wide, allowing you to ascend into your Nyx Maras with hard ascends. And the package overall with Nyx Mara is pretty small because you can just play 1 or 2 Bunnyx and then 1 of each Nyx Mara potentially. Maybe you play a little bit more given the fact that you can't play like Rise from the Ashes at 3 anymore. But generally the Nyx Mara are pretty easy. You get 1 on board and they're just going to keep trading, building up spirits onto your board, potentially allowing you to just punch for tons of damage or just hard ascend into something like a Cryo Scorch later on. Lots of really cool things you can do with this archetype, and it's going to be something that you pair with another Frost archetype, which is something Frost has been pretty good at, kind of doing 2 archetypes at once. This is just another archetype that you can pair with your Morphrost, with your Rhinostex, etc. Probably leaning towards pair this with the Morphrost because of the ability for Morphrost to go a bit wider, allowing you to plop Nyx Mara into play and let that kind of self-contained engine keep switching every turn while you do the other Morphrost things. That being said, also in Frost, very expensive archetype because you're every turn having to add a spirit or destroy these guys because you have to keep ascending them over and over and over again or destroy them. So your mileage may vary. Again, you're playing Frost. Frost has always been a very expensive element to play, but it has really cool kind of pairings and archetypes you could do with it. So the Nyx Maras look really fun and interesting. And next up in Frost, we have the Blizzard archetype, or at least the start of a Blizzard archetype, kind of how we had the Thunderstorm archetype. So we have Broomlinks that allow you to search for Blizzard or Mountain of Boreas, Frigicub that lets you return Blizzard from your underworld to your hand, and Shiver that allows you to special cast Frigicubs from your underworld. When you cast Blizzard, you can destroy an Elestral. So it kind of plays on how the Thunderstorm archetype works as like a starting package. I expect to see more Blizzard support in the future, or more Blizzards with different names, something like how Tsunami got different names. To make this archetype more fulfilling. It's not really a full archetype right now, but it is something that worth keeping note of because I think at least the Broomalinks and maybe the Chivalric might see a little bit of play going forward. But Blizzard Archetype on the way, it's relevant because, again, Frost archetypes like to mesh together really well, so it's something that you can potentially play with and play around as a way to find blizzards and recur blizzards. Means there's probably more blizzard support coming eventually, so it's worth noting here. Moving on to some of the solar support, again, I mentioned really briefly there's some Apollo support. However, outside of cows, we have Champions of Apollo Exaltus, which doesn't really care to be an archetype other than you're just playing a solar deck. But out of the new solar support cards, Solar Charge is something I do want to highlight. This does make a pretty significant Foster Cell buff, allowing you to play Larva Cell, Solar Charge it immediately, and go into full Foster Cell combos, and do some other shenanigans in Solar, allowing the Larva Cell Foster Cell deck to play a little less on the Thunder package, a little bit more on the Solar package, all through just this one card. This card, Solar Charge, can enable a lot of things, which is going to be very interesting. It's a card that should probably get its own video to talk about what we can do with it, but there's some shenanigans with ascending and nexusing and all that jazz that Solar Charge could be really interesting for. But yeah, there's really not a ton here for Solar other than if you like to play cows and you like to play Larva Cell, I guess. Next up, we'll talk briefly about the Earth card. So there is Champions Demeter stuff that cares about Demeter being in play. It's not an archetype. You can Vertilith to special cast 1 cost Earth stuff, which could be relevant to just get bodies on board. Then you have a 5/6 till end of turn Vertilith that doesn't want to be in attack position. There's a new Viserys support, which is cool to get you 3rd copy of Viserys back. Panzer, which is an interesting card, but it's I am so far behind. I can draw a bunch of cards now, but I have to give up my turn to play this Panzer. And in Earth, I want to do briefly talk about Ankle Surge and Ankle Shock, which is Thunder Earth, which they're not fully archetypes on their own. They're going to slot into probably other Earth archetypes, but I do think that Ankle Surge is something that people are sleeping on a little bit because it does allow you to draw a ton of cards, which, okay, yes, you have to discard cards, but drawing like 3-4 cards potentially off Ankle Surge every turn, if you can keep it on board for a turn or two, will significantly swing a lot of important kind of matches in your favor, because now you can fill up your back row and get counter runes and removal cards and other items where it's like it's just drawing a lot. I think we might see this in like an Earth Nexus build if Earth Nexus comes back into the fray at all, with like Bloom and stuff, so you can Ankle Shock Bloom to combat trick and then ascend into Ankle Surge, draw a bunch of cards, replace stuff that you don't need, etc. Really cool archetype, I think, with Earth Nexus that you can play into. It's some of the new Earth cards, specifically Ankle Surge, Panzer, Demeter. Even though she doesn't have a ton of support here, there could be some really cool deck archetypes you can build off these cards for Earth Nexus. We're kind of at a point now where we're going to kind of be speed running Lunar. There's more Lunar suppression tools. So we have Pandalants to start pinging. We have Spectaris that allows you to just special cast when things are suppressed. So potential new low ends for the Lunar / suppression control decks that have tried to exist the past couple formats. Additionally, in Lunar, we have more Like a Void support, so more Full Moon supports, able to get more Lunar aggro support going with the Like a Void and the Werepups, and that could also potentially get your Spectarises, the Champion Artemis, the new one, down to play as well, so new Lunar aggro support, and then some new Lunar Nexus support, which we didn't have a ton of before, with not many receivers or Nexusers in the format outside of like Fulgorix. But we have Nemastar and Terrastar that both like to Nexus and get lots of burn and direct damage going. So it gives some more aggressive threat possibilities to a Lunar Nexus deck. So within Lunar stuff, we have Lunar aggro support, we have Lunar suppression support, and we have Lunar Nexus support. None of which make a whole deck on their own, but may help other decks kind of that have been played in the past kind of be more supported. The Lunar Nexus is something I'm really interested in looking at because that is fairly new. We haven't had a ton of Lunar Nexus support, but maybe there's something cool there with the Terrastar. And last but not least, what I want to talk about is the Flammoth stuff, which is interesting, and it's a little bit like the Champions of Poseidon stuff, where the kind of new Nimbug supports the old Flammoth better, but the new Charcoon and Flammoth kind of do some things that are different and interesting. The new Nimbug allows you to search for Fully Forest, Charcoon, Flammoth, which there is a new Fully Forest that is an anti-stadium, which is interesting. So there's a lot of stadium stuff floating around in this set between spiders and maybe Water Reanimator, etc. That is potentially a relevant thing to search Fully Forest. Charcoon and Flammoth, you can use this Nimbug to find your Flammoth, which a lot of the problems with the old Flammoth was finding it, so you can do your Tower of the Winds combos to get it out efficiently. This will allow you to enable that a little bit easier, where you can now just have a Nimbug plus Tower of Winds in your hand. to do the combo to get to Flammoth, which allows you to get to it much more consistently and earlier. And the new Charcoon cares about having lots of spirits onto it because it can burn your opponent if it gets destroyed by a rune effect. So if your opponent wants to Earthquake this Charcoon or Royal this Charcoon, they'll take a lot of damage back, which is cool and interesting, but probably won't see a ton of play. And the new Flammoth is just fine. It can reduce your opponent's stats by a chunk, which is relevant if you can get this out at a decent rate. And then you can destroy Fully Forest on your field to destroy everything on the board except for Flammoth, which again with the new Nimbo you can kind of search for Fully Forest, you can search Flammoth, so you can search the combo piece here before getting to Flammoth. Again, you're probably using Tower of Winds to get to Flammoth and Aeolus, and then you're just going to get this Flammoth out and potentially board wipe by popping your own Fully Forest, dodging Gorgons hopefully. But yeah, really cool, interesting archetype with Flammoth now that you can kind of actually play a Flammoth deck. Using old Flammoth or new Flammoth off the new Nimbug is probably the best card out of the new Flammoth line. And it's worth noting that this is the Fire Wind set, and this is the Fire Wind Elestral in the set. So it's cool to see it maybe playable. It's probably rogue at best, but it's worth noting as an archetype on its own because I think Wind Toolbox Flammoth is a really fun, interesting deck. And I think the new Nimbug actually enables you to play the Toolbox kind of Wind Nexus deck with Flammoth at the top end a lot more consistently than you have been able to in the past. Which is cool because Flammoth is a cool card. So with that, that is basically all the archetypes in Firestorm, essentially. I know I didn't go over every card and every possible archetype and all the support, etc. There's a lot here to go through, but these are kind of the main things I expect people to tinker with more so than others. Obviously, we didn't talk about like the champions of Keon, and we didn't really spot much on the champions of Apollo and the champions of Aeolus. They're there, they slot into other decks, but they don't make new archetypes or make old archetypes way better, so I didn't really want to go too far in depth into those cards. And yes, there's obviously like the boogeyman people talk about with the Leica Void, which I kind of glossed over because it's not new. It's just going into the Lunar aggro stuff as a new package, or other decks if they want to with the Full Moon package, which I don't think is the right play. I think if you're playing the new Leica Void, you're playing a suppression deck or you're playing an aggro deck. So I didn't spend too much time on those. But for the most part, this is the Firestorm archetypes. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think about the archetypes in the comments or whatnot. This is a YouTube video, I guess. And let me know if I didn't go over something that you thought was super important in the set, because I'm just doing this off a little notepad I have here. So let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.